Donc, bonjour, bienvenue tout le monde à ce webinaire d'Ouranos. Mon nom est Caroline Larrivée, je suis la directrice de la programmation scientifique chez Ouranos. Ça me fait vraiment plaisir aujourd'hui de présenter d'introduire le présentateur et son équipe pour ce projet autour de la sécurité alimentaire dans le nord du Québec, un enjeu important et critique face au changement climatique. Je vais commencer l'introduction en français pour expliquer un peu le déroulement, mais ensuite je vais passer en anglais pour présenter les présentateurs, les conférenciers, et les conférences auront lieu en anglais. So I'll switch to English to present the presenters. So it's really my pleasure to welcome and present Murray and his team. Murray Humphries is a wildlife ecologist based at McGill University. He has successfully managed to link fundamental ecological research with priorities and engagement of Indigenous communities, mainly in northern regions. Murray holds degrees from the University of Manitoba, bachelor's in science, from a master's from the University of Alberta, and a PhD from McGill University. He was also an NSERC postdoc fellow at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland before coming back to McGill, where we're really happy to have him. He is currently an associate professor of wildlife biology in the Department of Natural Resources, Resource Sciences at McGill University. He is also the director of the Center for Indigenous Peoples Nutrition and Environment. He holds a research chair in Northern Research at McGill, and he's a member of the Quebec Center for Biodiversity Science. He is accompanied today by several of his students, although Gwyneth might not be here today, but I'll still present her because she was part of the project. So Gwyneth Macmillan, who's a postdoc fellow also working on knowledge co-production and moose habitat quality in the Cree region of Eeyou Istchee. Nathan Badry, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is a PhD candidate focused on local food value networks, actor networks, and qualitative methods. Alexandra Langwieder is and again, I'm sorry if I mispronounced, she's a master's student working on community-based monitoring of polar bears in the Eeyou Istchee marine region. Christine Ha is a PhD candidate focused on community youth and local food literacy in Eeyou Istchee. Mikhaela Neelin is a graduated master's student, so congratulations. She's currently working as a coordinator for the Nunavik Hunting, Fishing, Trapping Association, where she continues to work on the distribution and impact of beaver in Nunavik. And interestingly enough, that is one of very tangible examples of the impacts of a warming climate. And finally, Allison Ford is also a PhD candidate whose work focuses on seasonal phenological knowledge and culturally important plants in the Eeyou Istchee region, so the Cree region around the James Bay, sorry. So Murray, I think I will just hand it over to you. You can complete any presentations that I didn't offer correctly. We'll let you go ahead, you and your students, to present, and I'll come back at the end to kind of facilitate the question period. Again, I encourage participants to just enter questions in the chat. We'll moderate that at the end. So with that, thank you very much for being here, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Caroline, for that introduction, and thanks to all the members of the WeCliffs project team, all the students and contributors for being here. It's just a real thrill. We're very excited to have this opportunity to present our work, and very grateful for the support from Ouranos to make this work possible. So the title of our presentation is Wildlife, Environmental Change and Local Indigenous Food Systems in Northern Quebec. And we kind of use the abbreviation WeCliffs to describe that project and this kind of set of work that we will describe to you today. So as just kind of a roadmap for our presentation, we'll begin with an introduction to local Indigenous food systems and to the social ecology of Northern Quebec. We'll spend a lot of, I think, the innovation and kind of ground gained through this work is really not just about the knowledge outputs, but the approaches of knowledge and the approaches of collaboration. And so we'll spend a little bit of time kind of running through some multidisciplinarity, knowledge diversity, and knowledge co-production approaches, including some internship approaches that our students have taken. Then we'll talk about 4 foundations of local food security, often referred to as pillars, but we'll suggest in this presentation to be thought of as foundations, and a value chain network model that has kind of guided our work. Then we'll kind of dive into wildlife harvest and local food use in Northern Quebec, describing the local food systems in the regions of Eeyou Istchee and Nunavik. And then we'll run through some climate change impacts on key food species, as well as some ecological production modeling that we've undertaken as a team. We'll then transition into 9 suggested possible adaptation strategies for local food security under climate change before wrapping up with a synthesis and conclusions and a discussion and question period at the end. The students will kind of jump in and co-present with me along the way. Local Indigenous food systems involve the harvest, consumption, and conservation of local biodiversity for health. And so we can suggest that as a definition. These food systems are often referred to as traditional food systems in a First Nations context, or country food systems in an Inuit landscapes, Inuit Nunavut. And because of those 2 different terminologies, we've kind of used the shared terminology of local Indigenous food systems and really emphasize that they involve both harvest, consumption, and conservation or stewardship of local biodiversity. Local food is a critical source of energy, protein, and nutrients for Indigenous peoples. So we can think of these food systems as nutritional value, contributing nutritional value, but they contribute much more than nutrition. They embody the knowledge, relationships, and reciprocities that connect people to land, creating the possibilities of being alive well. And that is a translation of a Cree concept that's been communicated by especially Max-Stu elders and Naomi Adelson's work, referring to this conception of being alive well. So the work that we're going to describe to you today involves the Inuit region, or the Nunavimmiut region of Nunavik, and the Cree region, or Eeyou region of Eeyou Istchee, and has been done with funding support through Oranos and the Institut Nordique du Québec and MFFP, NSERC, Government of Canada, Adaptation Fund, and McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative. And the work has been done in collaboration with regional organizations, as well as community and local land users and knowledge holders. And some of the key organizations involved in the work in Nunavik include Makivik and KRG, the Kativik Regional Government, the Hunters and Trappers Association, or the ARNUC, the Nunavik Regional Board of Health and Social Services, and the Nunavik Marine Region Wildlife Board. And within Eeyou Istchee, some regional partners include the Cree Nation Government, the Eeyou Marine Region Wildlife Board, the Cree Trappers Association, the Cree Health Board, and Niskanen. Climate change is projected for Quebec and for Northern Quebec with a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warming in average annual temperature, with a general warming gradient that increases from south to north. Lots of great modeling work and projection work done by Oranos is focused on bioclimatic indicators like growing degree days, which are really, really helpful and useful for thinking about the ecological production components of local food systems. Considerations like, for example, snow cover and whether increases in winter precipitation will be enough to compensate for a shorter freezing season, and the likelihood that even with increased precipitation in the winter, that the winters and periods of snow cover are likely to be shorter in the future, as well as lots of good work on observed climate change and observed patterns of change, both in the offshore region of James Bay and Hudson Bay, and Hudson Strait and Ungava Bay, as well as the interior regions of Northern Quebec. We want to emphasize at the start of the presentation how the extent to which climate change is a driver of ecological and social change in Northern Quebec intersects with 300 years of natural resource development. On the left here is a summary of Hudson Bay fur trading posts, which were started in the region in the 1740s and continued as late as the 1970s, around which the local food system has operated and been supported and been compromised in different ways for nearly 300 years. More recently, but throughout, especially concentrated in the eastern side of Quebec near Labrador and around Shefferville, and in the northern regions near the Raglan mine, and in the southern regions near Eeyou Istchee is a lot of mining development. Hydroelectric development that's concentrated on the James Bay, east-west rivers flowing into James Bay, and especially associated with the La Grande developments, and more recently the Rupert River diversion that has diverted water north into the La Grande system through the East Main 1 and the Bernard Laundry generating stations. And finally, forestry, especially concentrated in the southern adapted forestry regime area within the central interior portions of Eeyou Istchee, which is another major driver of change within the landscape. So you'll often hear us use the expression environmental change and the impacts of environmental change on the local food system. And by using that word, we're being purposefully inclusive of multiple stressors and multiple drivers that include but are not limited to climate change. Okay, so that's a brief introduction to local Indigenous food systems, the partners involved in our work in the Cree region of Eeyou Istchee and the Inuit region of Nunavik. And now we're going to talk a little bit about multidisciplinarity, knowledge diversity, and knowledge co-production. Local Indigenous food systems are situated at the intersection of health, social, and natural sciences. We put climate change here within the natural sciences, but it's certainly itself an interdisciplinary topic of study. But if we think of studying the biophysical climate aspects, if we think of studying culture, knowledge, and governance, if we think of studying nutrition, wellness, and healthcare, we're often separating ourselves between kind of traditional disciplinary silos and different faculties and departments within a university context. There are, of course, many interdisciplinary frameworks, and I've included a few here: social determinants of health, social-ecological systems research, or environmental health subdisciplines. And these are really important, and they seek to bridge across these disciplinary divides. But as kind of illustrated here, they're inevitably distorted by and situated in some ways of the shadows of the disciplines that they seek to bridge. We, as a team, and this is a presentation of the major PIs, principal investigators, and graduate students that are involved in the WeCliffs project, including myself, with more of a background in the natural sciences. Trina Delormier at the top, Gane Gahaga scholar, Indigenous health researcher, focused on health, nutrition, food sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. And Gordon Hickey, a social scientist focused on natural resource governance, social ecological networks, and sustainability. And then the diversity of graduate students and undergraduate students doing research projects. And you'll notice, you can kind of see their names and project titles are colored by those disciplinary spaces. So we want to respect those disciplinary distinctions and try to advance in kind of unique disciplinary space. But we'd argue research on local food systems cannot be merely interdisciplinary. Incorporating natural health and social science dimensions is necessary but not sufficient. And that local food systems research really needs to achieve, or at least aspire towards, transdisciplinarity, or a dissolving of those disciplinary boundaries. And in particular, research on local Indigenous food systems needs to move beyond the disciplinary assumption that the natural world, the social world, and the health of people can be studied, envisioned, talked about, modeled as separate things. Okay, we're going to do our first transition to Mikhaela, and I'll ask Mikhaela Neelin to cover the next few slides.
So oftentimes when graduate students begin their research, it looks a bit like this. We start by looking at the literature that's already there and take a lot of time to do some literature review and to prepare. And the brain is to represent bringing that knowledge together and creating hypothesis, research question, planning out methodologies. That takes quite a bit of time. The size is trying to represent the amount of time dedicated to each step. And then oftentimes there's a quick visit into the communities, a rather short time frame to do your field research, often during the summer, to meet community members, to get all the data, and then you come back and have to write it up, have to bring it all together, to synthesize, to write up your thesis, and to submit it. And that's all under big time pressure. The clock is to represent that you only have 2 years and you need to finish it quickly. What we've done in this lab is a little bit different. I like to call it an alternative approach to research. And oftentimes we've taken actually an internship approach, which has really helped a lot of the graduate students under Murray to do really effective knowledge co-production. So when we're talking about knowledge co-production, we're talking about really being involved with the community throughout the process. One way to make that happen without being a big burden on the community is to start by doing an internship. And so the internship is an opportunity to go into the community and to network, but to contribute to an organization that's already in place, and to contribute our knowledge and graduate experience to date to contribute to that organization. And so that's what's represented here by the shaking hands. It's meeting, it's networking while contributing through an internship. And I included too the fishing symbol because oftentimes when you're in communities, you're meeting people, you're on the land, you're really getting exposed to more the culture, the people, and you're able to form collaborations quite early on. And then after that, not to say you can't read books beforehand, but after that, you're bringing it together. You're really taking the time to look at your questions, to start to discuss what literature has been done before, and informed by that internship, you can start to create those questions for your research that are pertinent to the community. And then you're going into the community, you're doing your field work, you're getting the data, you're meeting with the communities that you've already met. And then you're coming back and you're synthesizing that, you're creating you're starting to think about how to analyze that. And then you return to the communities, or you continue with communication with communities in order to interpret what does this mean, what does my data mean. And I have arrows going to the pencil crayon and back to the consultations, because it's not a straight flow. It's really going back and forth. You start writing, you have questions, you want to hear their input into that writing process. And so it's not a straight line. It goes back and forth, and you're checking in at multiple stages. This approach, it's longer. It's hard to get it in under your time constraint. It took me a bit over 3 years for my master's, but what I was able to do was I was able to really be communicating with the community and making sure that that knowledge is co-produced the whole way through. So my personal internship, next slide, was with Nunavik Corporation in Nunavik. Most of the students that you've seen here have been through internships of their own, but my specific one happened in 2018 and continued afterwards, working with Nunavik Corporation to summarize community concerns about climate change and how it impacts Arctic char. And so that was, I already had in mind maybe what I would be working on for my graduate research, but I wanted to keep an open mind to make sure that was in line with community priorities, and this internship really helped. I was able to work out of the research center at Nunavik and meet with a lot of of people, a lot of hunters, a lot of fishermen, to discuss what their concerns were. And I was able to synthesize it, next slide, into a report for Nunavik, which you can actually access online through ASTIS, the links on this slide. And it took me a few years to complete the report, but it was looking at what climate change impacts are community members really concerned about for Arctic char. And 3 of them had to do with barriers, through drying up of streams, through permafrost making banks slip and block the stream, through beavers damming up streams. Those can block Arctic char when they're going migrating to lakes for winter, and can affect Inuit access to Arctic char. And then the last concern that really was brought up often was the appearance of new species like salmon, like suckerfish, which can create either competition or predate on Arctic char and affect the population that way. And so these were some of the concerns that came up during my internship, which I'll be speaking about a little bit more later. But I wanted to mention that this internship really allowed me to network quite well, and in fact led me to be currently working for the Hunting, Fishing, Trapping Association of Nunavik. And that really came from the internship, from being able to meet with people and take that time before I was really on my main research agenda to hear what communities had to say.
Thanks so much, Mikhaela. And Mikhaela is connecting to us today, to the presentation today from Tasuyak, Angava Bay, on the west side of Angava Bay, just north of Kuujjuaq. So it's great to have Mikhaela here and contributing from Nunavik. So this is a recent publication describing knowledge co-production for sustainability research and highlighting some important components of knowledge co-production to situate the process in a particular context, place, or issue, to explicitly recognize multiple ways of knowing and doing, to articulate clearly defined, shared, and meaningful goals that are related to the challenge at hand, and to allow for ongoing learning among actors, active engagement, and frequent interactions. And so Mikhaela's pen and the two-way arrows between community and pen, I think, speaks to that interaction element. So through the WeCliffs project, we've kind of highlighted our approaches to knowledge co-production, and that we seek to foster ethical, effective, and meaningful long-term research collaborations with organizations, communities, and individuals in Northern Quebec. And this just illustration produced by Gwyneth Macmillan is meant to illustrate this recognition that there's multiple levels of knowledge co-production with individuals, with individual knowledge holders, with individual communities and bands and councils, or land claim organizations and other kind of community-based organizations. With the RNUC is a regional hunters and fishers trap association in Nunavik, but there's LNUCs, which are the local hunters, fishers, and trappers associations. The same in the Eeyou Istchee region. There's the regional Cree Trappers Association, as well as the community-specific trappers associations. And it's really important to work at both those levels, not just one or the other. And then there's the umbrella regional organizations like the regional CTA or Cree Nation government in Nunavik, Makivik, and KRG, some of the marine wildlife boards, etc. And then there's the provincial governments and federal governments and boundary organizations like Oranos. So lots of different layers, and we've tried as much as possible through these projects to work directly and in collaboration with all those levels of organizations. Some of the research principles and ethical principles is to respect the self-determination in research for the Cree of Eeyou Istchee and the Inuit of Nunavik. At the same time, kind of ensuring we do our job as scientists, maintaining academic integrity and research to promote the best possible science. So to respect Indigenous ways of knowing, to foster co-learning throughout the research process, to agree on data sharing, ownership, and publications, maintaining respectful two-way communication, understanding research ethics and informed consent. We just wanted to give an example of how knowledge co-production can focus and work in a collaborative multi-sense project. And this example that Gwyneth Macmillan is leading as a postdoctoral research within our group focuses on moose habitat quality in Eeyou Istchee under the adapted forestry regime. And moose in this region, as you're going to see in a few moments, is a really important food species, an important cultural species, an important just a cultural keystone species, as Allison Ford will refer to it later. The objective of this is to evaluate moose habitat quality on the Cree territory of Eeyou Istchee, and specifically on the adapted forestry regime, which has been implemented now for about 20 years and is meant to help maintain and protect moose habitat and the habitat of other wildlife in these special sites of special wildlife interest that have been identified by Cree tallymen on their territory. And this research project includes blending Western science and government science approaches of moose collaring and habitat quality analysis through moose collars that have been deployed by the AMFFP, led by Vincent Brodeur and collaborators, and Cree knowledge of habitat quality within trap lines and how habitat quality has changed over time inside and outside of these 25% areas relative to the forestry measures that have been implemented. And so knowledge co-production requires relationship, it requires frequent engagement, it requires research methodologies and tools that are kind of mixed methods approaches for blending very diverse types of knowledges and data sets. And so this particular project takes co-development and co-prioritization of the questions and the approaches, a component on Cree knowledge, a component on analysis of GPS collars, and an approach of knowledge integration that blends across the entire project. So we have a formalized project steering committee that includes the MFFP, the Cree Nation government, the Cree Quebec Forestry Board, the Cree Trappers Association, members of our research center, the Center for Indigenous Peoples, Nutrition and Environment, the Cree Nation of Namaska, the Cree Nation of Nisissani, the Cree Nation of Ojiboogamoo, and the Cree Nation of Wiswanipi. So representatives from all. And since the project started in June 2020, this steering committee meeting has met 14 times to discuss the project, to discuss the approaches, to discuss the goals of the research. Gwyneth conducted interviews with members of the steering committee right near the start of the project to ask questions like, what is the shared goal that we're trying to address? What are the best approaches to that goal? This project will be successful if, what are some reasons that we might be challenged to be successful in this project? And letting members steer the project in that very explicit way and say things to us and to each other on the steering committee, like it's going to be important to talk about what Cree people know and understand moose habitat and behavior from whatever knowledge our people have here. Biologists will have their understanding of all this, and I know that's a big part of this project, but it's going to be important to look at both knowledge types to get a better understanding of the health of the moose population, as well as their habitat. And that was contributed by a community representative on the steering committee. Gwyneth and Nathan and Eleanor and another undergraduate that's not with us today, but Carl Antoine were able to visit the communities in a window of opportunity within the pandemic this fall, and conducted 37 Cree knowledge interviews with over 50 participants from 4 communities. They used a relationship mapping technique called fuzzy cognitive mapping to understand the key variables that influence moose habitat quality on the trap lines. And so you can kind of get a sense of that. You can see the images and the post-it notes that they're using during these interviews to try to understand what are the drivers of moose habitat quality, everything from forestry to climate change to invasive species to human harvest to road access and those kinds of variables. The other component of the work then ask the moose the same question through the collars and through their selection of habitats in this region within the adapted forestry regime. And these collars have recently been redeployed farther north outside of the zone of commercial forestry to start to think about latitudinal gradients and habitat quality and what moose habitat selection looks like in less disturbed, more colder climate regions. And then the real challenge is bringing those disparate forms of evidence and knowledge together in a cohesive way that respects the integrity and independence of each of those knowledge systems, but allows intersection and contact and co-informing. And so we're using a weight of evidence approach. What does the research tell us? What do people tell us? We don't want to smooth over those distinctions. We want to highlight them and try to understand them. We don't want to use one to validate the other, but together bring them together and understand from a consensus perspective what is known to be true and what some of the remaining questions are. So that example wasn't as directly related to the climate change components of the work that we've done, but we thought it was a useful example of knowledge co-production in action and how very different knowledge approaches can be brought together within the same project under a knowledge co-production framework. So now we're transitioning to 4 foundations of local food security and a value chain network. I'll do the front part of this and then I'll pass it on to Nathan and Christine to describe this value chain network in different ways. So you'll often, in the topic of food security, people will often refer to pillars of food security, and these are sometimes 4 and sometimes 6 and sometimes defined in different ways. And we've adopted a 4-pillar approach focused on availability, accessibility, adequacy, and use. And these are often presented as pillars that support a foundation towards kind of an aspirational ceiling or goal of local, in this case, local food security. Mikhaela helped with this infographic to help us kind of understand what's the difference between availability and accessibility or adequacy. Where does one stop and the other begin? And we think of availability as, are the wildlife species available to be harvested? Are they there in the landscape? Is the population present? Is the species present? Accessibility is the next level. If they're there in the landscape, can I get them? Can I get them as a harvester? Do I have the equipment? Do I have the know-how? Do I have the experience, the opportunity? Are they in a place that I can get to? That's an accessibility pillar. And then the adequacy, well, even if they're there and they're accessible, would I like to eat them? Are they safe to eat? Are they free of contaminants and disease? Are they the right species? The species that local land users prefer and have the cultural knowledge available to harvest. So when we think of availability, we're thinking that that's negatively affected by species extirpation or population declines or shifting range distributions. When we're thinking about accessibility, we're thinking about difficulty of traveling to harvest locations or returning safely to communities, or equipment required to successfully and safely harvest available wildlife and the time and money required to do so. When we're thinking adequacy, it's about reduced body condition or altered taste or parasite and disease or contaminants as things that could lead to inadequacy, or the spread and establishment of non-preferred species. If there's beaver in the landscape but not char, that could be a problem of adequacy of the food, of the meat that's available on the land. And use, the harvest and consumption of local food that is available, accessible, and adequate. At the end, even if something is there and accessible and adequate, it may not be used. And if it's not used, then the full value of a local food system will not be realized. In this presentation, we're going to suggest to think about those pillars in a different way, and not so much as pillars, but really foundations, and that there's a hierarchy to these pillars, these foundations, with availability forming a broad base that is a precondition for the other 3, and use positioned at this critical place at the top as an essential connection between people and nature that is a prerequisite for the other three layers to contribute to food value, a bottleneck, a constraint through which all the opportunity presented by availability, accessibility, and adequacy must be realized. So we'll try to refer to these components of local food security as foundations rather than pillars. All right, I'll pass now to Nathan Badry, a PhD student, to talk about the value chain network.
Good morning, everybody. So building on this discussion of the 4 pillars of food security, I'm going to speak a little bit to what we've been calling the wild food value chain. And this value chain kind of reflects how we come to understand food systems through this research. It's helped us in our work think more holistically about the different food systems we've been working with. This is a photo I took at the gathering at Old Nemiska in 2019. The gathering is an annual celebration at the old community site on Lake Nemiska. These geese were being prepared for the feast that marks the end of the gathering, where everyone comes together and eats together. And actually all the photos you see while I'm speaking, I took in Nemiska or in Old Nemiska. If you go to the next slide, right? So kind of the starting point for this value chain was that most food systems research in Indigenous contexts seem to be focusing on impacts and outcomes and asking questions like what is affecting food systems and why are these food systems so important? And these questions are obviously really crucial, but they can sometimes leave out the food system itself. And for some of us, it was these food systems and the complexity within them that we were interested in. And food systems have both ecological and cultural elements to them, social elements. And these elements intersect in interesting ways. On the ecological side, you have diversity of wild organisms that are being consumed as food, their species identities, ecological niches. And on the cultural side, social side, you have not only the traditional ecological knowledge of lands and wildlife, but also knowledge of equipment and how to travel on the land and go out to harvest. And then you also have things like issues of taste and preference and identity and spirituality. And so we adopted a value chain approach to help think about these systems and the complexity. And in addition to helping us understand these systems, we were hoping that this approach would help us understand other things as well, like the impacts of climate change on these systems and how these systems can adapt. And so this is the value chain that we produced, or the current version. And from this value chain perspective, local Indigenous food systems can be thought of as a sequence of primary activities here in the middle. And these are enabled by supporting conditions at the top, and then these generate value at the bottom. And the value encompasses all of the positive outcomes of the local food system. And this could include things like well-being and medicine. It could also include things like reciprocity. Primary activities range from preparation for the harvest to preparing and eating the food at the end. And then supporting conditions at the top include things like ecological production, social institutions. And the color gradients, they reflect the typically siloed knowledge domains. So knowledge, natural science in green, social science in gold, and health science in purple, kind of all coming together within this value chain. If you go to the next slide, right? So that's the current version of the value chain, but this value chain has evolved considerably throughout the course of the project as we work and learn new things. And one of the events that was really important to the evolution of this wild food value chain was the Regional Climate Change Forum. And this forum was organized by the Cree Nation government in East Maine in 2018. And at this forum, we presented an earlier version of the value chain, and we got some really important feedback. So the current version of the value chain, the initial primary activity is preparation. But before the forum, it actually started with access. But while we were at this forum and speaking with people, the importance of preparation was really stressed to us. And Christine's going to talk a little bit more about this, I think, after me. But in our discussions, access was always preceded by preparation. And this preparation could include gathering and packing equipment. It could include organizing with other harvesters, arranging time off of work or time for childcare. And of course, it also involved kind of the lifelong ceremony and learning that ensured that harvesting activities followed tradition, that they were safe, that they were respectful. So that was added to the wild food value chain following the forum. The other thing that we heard about was the importance of situating value chains in time and place. So if you go to the next slide, Mary. I think later in the presentation, Ali's going to talk a little bit more about this too. But some of the important kind of place and time-based factors that were brought up to us were things like directions and winds, weather, conditions out on the land, locations of different habitat types, seasonal calendars, the life cycles of animals. And we learned that it was really important for us to think about value chains in the context of these things. And so here's kind of another way which we've been using to conceptualize the wild food value chain, an example from Eeyou Istchee, of course, from Waswanipi. And so here, the value chain is situated at the center of the 6 seasons, as well as the harvest calendar of Waswanipi, and the 4 directions, kind of illustrating that each aspect of the value chain is deeply embedded in place and time. And I'd like to talk just briefly a little bit about my own research in the context of the wild food value chain. And part of my work has involved the study of lake sturgeon, and more specifically, lake sturgeon governance. And I conducted a case study kind of focused on lake sturgeon governance in Nemaska, Eeyou Istchee, and I made 3 visits there in 2019, where I worked with about 28 members of the community, varied gender and age and experience. And each of these, or rather, I involved participants who, in some capacity, were involved at each stage of the wild food value chain. And I don't have a ton of time to get into my results, but I want to highlight a few kind of quotes that stood out for me that were related to the value chain. If you go to the next slide, Mary. So, thinking about a value chain situated in space and time, this is something a participant told me that really stood out for me. They said that once that pops out to a leaf and comes to the size of a beaver's ear, that's one sign. And then you'll hear the difference in the sound of the rapids because they're swimming or approaching the area. You listen carefully. You'll know the sounds of the rapids has changed. Then you'll hear some frogs. Then all the ice will dissipate or go, and then they'll spawn. And this participant was talking about knowing the time to go fish for sturgeon. When are the sturgeon spawning? And this was something that was actually communicated to me by several people, that the right time to go sturgeon fishing was when leaves on the banks of the rivers had reached the size of beaver's ears. If you go to the next slide, Brian, thank you. So kind of through this research, I was able to identify things in this value chain that were influencing governance, things that you would expect. So, tallymen were, of course, a really important institution in Nemaska, controlling when you could harvest sturgeon, who could harvest sturgeon, smoke huts, and the women whose knowledge was required to run the smoke huts. These were really important for processing and storage. Elders were, of course, really important in sharing networks, and the Rupert River diversion, the hydroelectric project, has really impacted access to sturgeon on the Rupert River. But there were unexpected findings as well, at least unexpected to me. Things that I didn't really expect to be influencing governance in such a direct way. People with full-time jobs didn't have the time to go fishing, and so the wage economy was really impacting access to sturgeon. Residential schools were often brought up to me as a reason that sturgeon knowledge hadn't been passed on to them. Participants would tell me about how this impacted their ability to learn about sturgeon. And the relocation in 1970 of the community from the old Nemaska site to Lake Champion really changed the way that people interacted with sturgeon. And I have one final quote for you. He says that he doesn't know why they don't go sturgeon fishing. He says, I know there are people that do want to go, that would like to go, that like to go sturgeon fishing. And ever since we've left Old Nemiska, he says the generation now, they were never exposed to the way the sturgeon used to be. So this participant was speaking about how ever since the community was relocated nearly 50 years ago now, people haven't really had the same relationship with sturgeon that they used to. And so obviously this is really impacting the way that people interact with sturgeon. And we can think about that in terms of the value chain. If you go to the last slide, Marie. So I just wanted to say that using this wildlife value chain as a conceptual tool, it's really helped me to analyze the elements of the lake sturgeon value chain and governance and the different ways they intersect. And I was able to do so without having to worry too much about getting stuck in that particular disciplinary silo and working across disciplines. And I think Christine is going to talk a little bit about her work now.
Thanks, Nathan. And over to Christine.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So my expertise is more in nutrition, and it kind of follows up what Nathan had just spoken about. So he had mentioned that a lot of people aren't practicing a lot of traditional food practices as much for reasons in that case of the relocation. But there's also a lot of other reasons where youth just aren't as engaged with the traditional food system today. So this brings me to talk about the concept of food literacy. That is what my research is focused on. And it basically is understood as people gaining the collective awareness, the knowledge, the skills, and empowerment to access the traditional food system for improved nutrition and well-being. But in the current definition of the term, the literature, it focuses on access to market food-based systems. So this is actually a Western perspective of what food literacy is understood to be. And in our project, we're using this concept as a bridge to understand the context of the market food systems and its attributes that favor, in my research, we'll use it as a lens to understand the distinct Indigenous worldview of the process of the youth gaining the skills and knowledge. And this will be understanding their interactions with the environment and knowledge holders related to traditional foods. So you want to have youth engaged within the traditional food system, working with elders and knowledge holders and interacting in these practices, and understand what goes into the process of learning these knowledge and skills. So there's important distinctions between this Western perspective versus the Indigenous perspectives of the concept of food literacy. And so we aim to elaborate this concept using evidence from youth, as I mentioned before, and that is the focus of my project. So a lot through my internship with the Cree Nation government, we engaged youth in the climate action project to have them part of the discussions about how climate change is affecting the community and what are the key things that the community wanted to have in the adaptation plan to ensure that despite climate change, people are still practicing traditional foods. And one of the main things that came out of that project was that youth don't have sufficient knowledge or skills to access the food system within the context of climate change impacting it or not. And so that's how my project came to be, to focus on youth. So through the youth experiences, we want to propose a new concept of what traditional food literacy will look like, and to basically characterize the components that are unique to the traditional food system. So for example, a Cree youth out on the land will not know how to will not need to know how to read a food label, which is what is part of the definition of food literacy today. But rather on the land, you might need to know how to read the landscape and have knowledge about navigating ice safety, how to hunt a moose or fish for sturgeon. So once you have the knowledge to fish for sturgeon, you then need to know how to prepare it for consumption or for preserving it, and also to be shared with others. That is also part of Cree culture, and that might be part of this new concept of traditional food literacy. So to understand, and it's important to understand this and have the youth part of these learning processes because it's important for health and well-being. So even today, it's always said that the traditional food is important for health, well-being, and essential to Cree identity. So this was something that was emphasized to me by a lot of Cree elders and knowledge holders during my time in the community of Wamachtu. And one of the main reasons that we're focusing on this in nutrition is because we've seen that even with a small amount of traditional food in your diet, it significantly improves your dietary quality overall. And one thing that we did notice in the literature as well is that there's an observed nutritional shift from the consumption of traditional foods to a diet that is more focused on market-based diets, which is less healthy for the youth, and it's most prominent among the youth than older adults. So we've seen that as the newer generations grow up, there's less and less people eating traditional foods. And it was an identified need from the community that they wanted us to focus this project on having youth gain the knowledge and skills to be introduced to a lot of the traditional practices that they participate in the past. So one of the examples is that I want to emphasize with the value chain is this, so to bring it back. So to give a practical example, so as you can see here, all the supporting and primary activities are interconnected by all the arrows that you see. So how I understand this value chain and using it as a conceptual framework for my project is that food literacy is a bit of an umbrella for all these different components. So for example, knowing the right people, which can be elders or family members who can teach them certain skills is important for them to then be able to learn about migration patterns of geese. Next, they need to know where and when they should hunt for geese on the territory and then how to hunt. Once they've done so, they'll need to know how to prepare the geese, for example, plucking it, preparing it on the land, and then there might be a different step of food preparation when you're back in the community, when you bring it there. So how do you break down the geese? How do you cook it? How do you prepare it? And again, part of it will be food sharing as well. And some of the values that come out of it could be well-being. A lot of food is regarded as medicine in the communities. It's important for nutrition, their culture, their identity. So these are just some ways. This is just a way to understand why traditional food literacy is so complex, and for us to better understand this, understand it to support the Cree community's identified needs of engaging more youth in traditional activities to carry out and continue to practice Cree culture. Okay.
Thanks so much, Christine and Nathan. So with this next section of the talk, we're going to get a little bit into the details of wildlife harvest and local food use in Northern Quebec, a little bit more data rich in terms of looking at the species that are most important as contributors to the local food use in the two regions in Northern Quebec. So I won't talk about this at the end, but it's, I think, an important point to make that food use, because of Indigenous harvest rights, patterns of subsistence wildlife harvest and food use are not well quantified and well described. In some ways, we're fortunate in Northern Quebec that there's two main data sources from the 1970s that did extensive wildlife harvest survey work associated with the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. And the one report from Eeyou Istchee was called The Wealth of the Land, Wildlife Harvest by the James Bay Cree, 1972 to 73 to 1978 to 79. And an equivalent study was done a few years later, the final report called Research to Establish Present Levels of Native Harvesting for the Inuit of Nunavik from 1976 to 1980. So there's these base of detailed and I think high quality harvest data surveys from that era that allows us to assess patterns of wildlife harvest and wildlife use in the two regions in that time period. And then the other two major data sources that we've accessed through this project are a multi-community environment and health study conducted by the Cree Board of Health and Social Services of James Bay and funded by Niskamun. And this was done in the period through 2005 and 2009. And a somewhat equivalent health survey. And so both of these latter two sources are focused on food frequency questionnaires. So not harvest surveys, but food use surveys done more in a health realm than a wildlife harvest realm. And the equivalent in Nunavik was the Nunavut Inuit Health Survey. I can't say it very well. I should, maybe Mikhaela can help me, but the How Are We survey, the Kenyipta survey that asks, was ship-based and conducted through researchers, especially Laval and associated with ArcticNet, and led by the Nunavik Health Board in 2004. There's a more recent Inuit health survey that's just being started to be published and spread, but we haven't yet accessed those data as part of our analysis, and that would be an interesting next step for this project as if those data become more available for analysis. So what these 4 data sets essentially look like, and we include these in our report to Aranos, is this is the Eeyou Istchee Harvest Survey, and it might be small on your screen, but there's a bunch of species listed here, from moose to Canada geese to beaver to caribou to whitefish, and then each of the communities. And what the Harvest Survey estimated was the number of individuals harvested per year, as well as the edible yield based on the number of individuals harvested. So what fraction of a body mass of a moose or a Canada goose is consumed. And what we've done is then, based on the population size of the community, so this was the total food harvested, estimated harvest of the community at a community level, divided by the population of the community, then gives you an estimate of kilograms per person per year. And so we've done that for each of the communities and each of the species and summed across all the communities, and we'll show you those data in a bit more detail. The Nunavik harvest is the same. In this case, we're talking about ring seal and caribou and beluga. Again, we're converting from the number of individuals harvested to an estimate of edible yield to an estimate of edible yield per person, not per harvester, but per community member. And the Eeyou Istchee food frequency, now the survey instrument is asking the survey respondents, did you consume goose within the last year? 99% of people in Mistissini said yes to that question. And then for those that said yes, they said, how many days per month did you consume geese? And then we've made some assumptions about, on days that goose was consumed, how much grams of consumption were likely to have been involved. That allows us to use the same unit of kilograms per person per year from a food frequency survey as we would get from a harvest survey. So we've done that from the Eeyou Istchee food frequency surveys conducted by the Cree Health Board and published in the public domain. And we've done that for the Nunavik food frequencies survey done in 2004, published by Melanie Lemire and colleagues in a journal called Science for the Total Environment. So again, in this case, they actually estimated, they estimated both days consumed and the amount consumed. So we can go from the data they presented to a kilograms per person per year. So to take a bunch of data tables and present it in a form that might be a little bit more visually clear, here we've got a bubble plot with the size of the bubble reflecting the estimated yield, edible yield consumption from harvested animals in kilograms per person per year. And in red is the average across all communities. You can see that the moose is the most consumed, followed by Canada geese, followed by beaver, but there's lots of community to community variation with very little moose consumed in Wapmakstu, and the most moose consumed in the 1970s on a per capita basis in Nemaska. And here's the Nunavik harvest data, again, as a bubble plot. And on average, ring seal are the most harvested, with edible yield estimates from ring sealed harvest, peaking in communities of Kanjik, Sujuak, and Kilinik, which is a community that was surveyed in the 1970s and 80s, which hasn't been surveyed or included in recent. I don't think many people live in Killinick anymore. And Mikhaela can correct me if I'm wrong. And again, you see the community-to-community variation and the importance of ring seal or caribou, and some of the communities that consume the most ring seal and harvest the most ring seal harvest less caribou, and some that harvest a lot of caribou harvest less ring seal. And then you kind of can see the different species going down all the way down to snowy owls and Arctic foxes and wolves. This is the equivalent data from Eeyou Istchee food frequency survey. So we've switched from harvest to food surveys, and we've switched from 1970s to 2000, the early 2000s. And we see similar patterns. And we do the same with the Nunavut food frequency questionnaire conducted in 2004 and see the maintained importance of caribou. So maybe a way to put all these together and these kind of species icon plots, just this is averaged across all communities for the moment. We're not highlighting community to community differences within the regions, but more regional differences between the Eeyou Istchee and Nunavik. And the bigger the species here, the higher their estimate of kilograms per person per year. And I think that first, just comparing the slide from the top of the slide to the bottom highlights the vastly distinct local food systems of the Eeyou Istchee, of the Cree and Eeyou Istchee, and the Nunavut in Nunavik. That the Inuit food system is oriented especially around caribou and marine mammals like ring seal and beluga, and the sea run or landlocked Arctic char, whereas the Cree Eeyou Istchee local food system is especially oriented around moose and geese and beaver and some other land mammals like ptarmigan and berries. And Ali Ford is going to highlight for us in a little bit here the really importance of plant use that often gets missed, especially in harvest surveys, but can even be underrepresented sometimes in food consumption surveys that focus a little bit more on animals, especially because sometimes they're focused a bit on contaminant estimates and contaminant exposures that tend to be sometimes directed towards animal foods rather than plant foods. Small differences or large differences, we'll highlight some larger differences in a moment between the harvest data in the 70s and the food frequency data in 2000s. Moose going from first to second, goose being elevated to the first, most important here. And we'll talk a little bit about ring seal and kind of the vast reduction in ring seal from one survey period to the next. This is a bit more complicated, but to kind of one of the ways to highlight the diversity, both regional and community to community differences in food use, is to use a multivariate plot where we position communities in species space. So in a plot like this, the communities are the circles, and you can see all the Nunavik communities in blue and all the Eeyou Istchee communities in green. Communities that are positioned closer to each other in this plot harvest, and this is from harvest data from the 1970s, harvest more similar species in more similar proportions, whereas communities that are very far apart from each other in this plot harvest different species in different proportions. We've added species vectors here that help to explain the axes loadings. So now we're positioning communities in species space. And those communities that are most closely positioned to caribou and char, for example, in the Inuit space consume most of those species. And those species on the other side in green that are positioned most close to, say, moose or at the top here, we have speckled trout or brook trout would consume more of that species. And these are all kind of significant predictors and vectors, species vectors that help to explain this species space. And so what, is the take-home message from a plot like this? Well, certainly the very distinctiveness of the diets of Cree the local food use, or in this case, the harvest patterns of Cree communities from the Inuit communities in Nunavik, but also some kind of interesting regional within regions groupings. Whereas, for example, you might notice if you're familiar with the region, Kuujjuarapik and Kuujjuaq are the two most southern communities in Nunavik. Some of the communities down here are more Hudson Strait associated communities in Nunavik. And there's kind of a within region separation between southern to northern communities with more reliance on, for example, marine mammals in the Hudson Strait, and a little bit more reliance on caribou and char a little farther south. And the same within the Cree communities, there's this separation between the interior, more southerly Cree communities with moose and walleye, sturgeon, and pike, and the coastal communities and the more northern communities that get closer to brook trout and geese and species like that. It's amazing in some ways if you look at this distribution here. Remember that the input into this analysis is simply positioning communities in species space. There's no geographic information being put here, but this analysis situates, for example, the Cree communities of Wapmakstu, Chisasibi, Waminji, Eastmain, Waskaganish along a perfect north to south gradient along the James Bay coast, and clusters of three inland communities of Mistissini, Namaska, and Waswanipi very close to each other as this interior region. So it's very interesting how plotting communities in species space can highlight both the regional differences and the regional similarities at multiple scales. When many of you and as myself as a natural scientist, when I see that north-south sorting of communities, I certainly think about habitat gradients and climate gradients and habitat species distribution gradients. I think it would be hard for a harvester in Wapmakstu to focus too much on walleye. We do hear about moose moving farther north and being more available in Wapmakstu and southern Nunavik than they once were. So this could be changing over time. Certainly the change in caribou populations that have happened since the 2000 survey, since the James Bay harvest data, the changes in woodland caribou aren't captured by these two data sources. So it's important to highlight that these are dynamic over time. But I also want to highlight the importance of culture and identity and tradition in positioning communities in the species space. And just a small example, the Cree community of Wapmakstu is completely adjacent to the Inuit community of Kuujjuarapik. And here's the species icon bubble plot for the Cree members of that community that's situated right next to the Inuit community of Kuujjuarapik. And the Cree community there harvests geese and caribou and ptarmigan and whitefish and lake trout. And the Inuit community in Kuujjuarapik harvests spring seal and beluga and caribou, with a shared importance of geese and caribou across the two. And so culture as a defining feature beyond ecology, beyond location, needs to be emphasized in these kinds of analysis. So far, we've kind of highlighted kind of differences in relative use of species, but we haven't focused on the absolute levels. And I think these harvest surveys also provide us some information on relative use of different species in two periods separated by lots of years in between. Christine and others have spoke to declining use of local foods and scaling these icon graphs according to the relative use of food shows the declining reported use of species from 1976 to 80 to 2004 on a per capita basis. Remember, the population size has increased over this time, and this is a per capita estimate, kilograms per person per year. And importantly, this is harvest data and an estimate of edible yield, and this is consumption data and an estimate of consumption. And so these are both flawed measures of what people actually consumed in the 70s and what they consumed in 2004. And the data are only as good as the surveys and the information available. but there is strong evidence of a decline in per capita food use from the 70s to the 2000s based on this imperfect comparison of a mix of methods and a mix of data sources. So when I say in some ways we're lucky in Northern Quebec because there's some data available, in other ways, you know, the uncertainty around the validity of these estimates is really, really large. And so something to keep in mind as we look at them. But I did want to highlight here two, you know, major differences noted between the two surveys. And one is this ring seal, which was the first in the harvest data, and now 6 in the food frequency data, and beaver, which was 3rd in Eeyou Istchee in the harvest data, and down to 9th in the food frequency data. In some ways, it's not surprising. These are both species that are used both for fur and for food. And if you're transitioning from a harvest survey to a food use survey, you might expect some decline. So part of this might be a use of fur in the 70s relative to reduced use of food in the 2000s. But people eat beaver and Inuit rely very, very much on consuming ring seal. And the collapse of the fur economy between those two periods probably also accounts for a lot of this decline. And we think that's one of the kind of understudied, under-discussed features of the local food system is how that, we showed you the Hudson Bay fur post, how the changing subsistence economy in terms of commercial sale of fur has impacted the food economy in these regions across this era of change when lots of things have changed in addition to fur prices. Okay, just a last little section on the food use patterns in Northern Quebec. This is kind of, as ecologists coming at this project, one of the things that we're sensitive to is that body size varies a lot between the smallest species and the largest species, from a small fish to a bowhead whale, for example, or to a beluga. And that there's been lots of ecological literature on the importance of body size for many ecological factors. And so we worked on a paper that's now in press at FAST. It's called Weighing the Importance of Animal Body Size in Traditional Food Systems. And this is really cast North American wide. But in that plot, we highlighted this very general diversity pattern, which is, as you'll notice, there's a log scale axes and body mass here. But I teach this to my students in natural history of the vertebrates, that there are many small species and few large species. But if you log that axis, you'll also see there's relatively few very small species. But the most diverse fish weighs only about 10 grams. The most diverse birds weighs only about 20 grams. And the most diverse mammals weighs somewhere in that range of about 20 to 200 grams, depending on where you measure that peak. So there's a lot of species diversity at this very small size range, and very low species diversity at the largest size range. If you look at the species food use importance, the kilograms per person per year as a function of body size in Eeyou Istchee in the 70s, based on harvest data, in Eeyou Istchee in the 2000s, based on food frequency surveys, and doing the same in Nunavik, you see this pattern of disproportionate use of large species. Just in the dashed line here is the diversity, total species diversity as a function of body size, which is just carried over from this line here, the dashed line here, summing across birds, fish, and mammals generally here. And you see these small species that can be important, from whitefish to ptarmigan to brook trout to ducks and geese and rabbits. And they're important within the food system, but they tend not to be the most important species. And some of the most important species are caribou and beluga and seal and moose and so on. We'll come back to that. But when we're thinking about the availability of species in general, small species are more available than large species. And there may be adaptation opportunities here, in addition to harvesting these really important large species, of making more use of these more diverse smaller species. But we'll come back to that. Okay, transition now to climate change impacts on key food species. you can see the incredible diversity of species within the local food system. And as much as you might, look at this and say, oh, we really just need to talk about caribou and seals and char for Nunavik, and we just need to talk about moose and geese and beaver for Eeyou Istchee. That's not the case. And even if they show small in a bubble plot like this, there's the importance of a diversity of species across individual harvesters, households, communities has to be emphasized. So when we're thinking about climate change impacts on the local food system, we need to take a multi-species approach. So one of the things that Pascal Ropers did, who did a postdoc through the Weecliffs project for us, was, but first, before I do that, to highlight local observations of climate impacts and local knowledge, Cree knowledge of impacts in Eeyou Istchee and Inuit knowledge of impacts in Nunavik have been really well captured over the last 10 years through lots of initiatives, including these CNG community youth video projects of climate change impacts and adaptation that some of our students, Nathan and Christine, were involved in supporting through their internships. Many of this is summarized in the East Main Climate Change Report. Within Nunavik, some examples are a review of climate change and health in Nunavik and Labrador by Chris Fergal, Alan Currier's summary of knowledge of climate change in Nunavik, a really great compilation of climate change observations of Nunavimmiut and Nunavimmiut elders, so Nunavut elders and Nunavik elders, titled The Caribou Taste Different Now, and Mikhaela's summary of Nunavik community priorities and recommendations for Arctic char and changing climate. So just to emphasize the local knowledge of climate change impacts on these species. To then complement that local knowledge component, we conducted a literature review of scientific evidence of observed impacts and anticipated impacts on the key species. We based this on the most important species in the food system, and we really wanted to embrace the diversity of the species that contribute to it. 13 terrestrial species, 23 freshwater species, and move something to read, 15 marine species that are all documented as important food use through those harvest data and food frequency surveys. But recognizing that kind of studying each of these species in isolation wouldn't be as meaningful as kind of taking an ecosystem approach and thinking about changes within that ecosystem, whether it's a change in temperature or a change in snow or a change in ice-free seasons. We, through this literature review, basically organized it by what was the change, like in this example, air temperature, precipitation, and large-scale climate variation, and what were some described impacts of those drivers on species like beaver and lesser snow geese. The same, a different component of change happening with terrestrial system, changes in vegetation abundance and species composition, and what are some of those impacts on the diversity of those species, including, for example, spruce grouse and ptarmigan. Then within the aquatic freshwater regime, what about like a driver like water temperature and stratification? How's that affecting lake sturgeon and lake trout? And I've just included a couple of examples here, but the literature review goes through many, many more species. And just as an example of the marine environment, the change in ice, sea ice distributions, and those impacts on common eider and Arctic cod, among many other species. So just to give you a sense of what that literature review looks like, and that's available as a report that we've generated through the Arano sponsored work. For the next phase of the presentation, we identified through that, and as Mikhaela said, through internships and conversations with partner organizations, among the many anticipated and observed impacts, some really key knowledge gaps and priorities of local organizations. And these include, but are no means limited to, beaver and char in Nunavik, ptarmigan in Eeyou Istchee and Nunavik, moose habitat quality in Northern Quebec, culturally significant plants, seasonality and environmental change, sturgeon networks and collaborative governance, eelgrass declines in geese along the James Bay coast, and polar bear monitoring in the Eeyou Marine region. You've already heard a little bit about the Moose Habitat Quality Project and the Sturgeon Networks Project, but we're going to highlight 3 more in this next section of the presentation, starting with Mikhaela's work on beaver and char in Nunavik, then transitioning to Allie Ford and her work on culturally significant plants, and wrapping up with Alexandra and her work on polar bear monitoring in the Eeyou Marine region. So over to Mikhaela now.
So I mentioned earlier when we were discussing the internship project approach that I've done a report on Arctic char in a changing climate and the impacts of climate change on Arctic char. And so we showed these 4 panels, these illustrations of some of the key issues, concerns that harvesters had. And the one on the right side is a concern about other species of fish, specifically either competing with or predating on Arctic char. That includes like salmon and suckerfish. But the other 3 concerns, main concerns that were brought up, which are on the left 3, all have to do with barriers to Arctic char migration. And Arctic char, being an anadromous fish species, move each year. Well, not all of them are anadromous, but many of them move each year from the ocean to lakes and from saltwater to freshwater for overwintering. And so those anadromous Arctic char are really important for fishermen, for Inuit fishermen, to provide food. And on the bottom here, I just give a few pictures. The one on the right is Arctic char being prepared mostly during the summer. But those 2 photos on the left there with the ski-doo and the fishing, ice fishing, that just represents a lot of what happens during the winter for ice fishing to get Arctic char from the lakes. And Inuit harvesters know which lakes to go to, know where those Arctic char will be each year and where they'll be in the winter, and that directs their efforts. But when you have barriers like drying streams, slipping banks that cover the streams, like beaver dams that impede Arctic char migration, those Arctic char don't get to those normal fishing sites. They might move and go to other areas. They might move out of that area, and suddenly that knowledge of where to fish, it's not as useful. Those Arctic char might not be there. So that is the concern that's raised about barriers in the streams that Arctic char use during their short migration time. And so I focused in on my master's onto that one concern about beavers and their dams specifically affecting Arctic char migration, but you'll see that it affects some of these other concerns as well. And so the next slide just shows a few impacts that beavers might have in the Arctic. They're just starting to expand more and more north, and they're being observed by harvesters increasingly in Nunavik communities. And this is a very new question, like beavers in the tundra or even just in the north of the boreal forest, like where there's permafrost. That's a really new question that's been dealt with across Canada and the circumpolar north right now. And I'll get into that later, but there's lots of questions that come up in this new area. What are beaver impacts? And Arctic char migration and the impacts of dams on Arctic char migration is something that harvesters have been observing, the lower Arctic char numbers in areas that are dammed. That's something that fishermen shared during my internship and during my whole master's project. Another impact that beavers might have in the north is their effect on permafrost, which increases the speed of permafrost melt. And Ken Tape and his team in Alaska has done a lot of work on that. If you are interested in learning more, there's some great articles about the effects on damming on permafrost. And then there's also the impact that beavers have when they're creating these wetlands that really help a lot of southern species thrive. Salmon are known to really thrive in beaver areas, and many other species as well. The concern is that it's very helpful for southern species that are typically not as far north, and harvesters are already seeing that trend of species expanding northwards and new species appearing or increasing in numbers. And there's a lot of concerns about their impacts. A lot of, for example, a lot of harvesters mentioned concerns about salmon, which are not as favored as Arctic char, potentially competing with Arctic char. So these are some concerns that beavers in these northern environments in Nunavik, the impacts that they might have. So on my next slide, I go over very simply, for the short time limitation, very quickly some of the steps I took during my research. That includes Inuit knowledge interviews, community questionnaires with the broader community, not only the harvesters. That community questionnaire was to get overall perception of beavers and consideration for food and food preferences. There was a helicopter survey to look for beaver signs along Ungava Bay in Nunavik, which was based on some of those observations of beavers. We built it around having both transects where we were flying along areas that beavers had already been seen by harvesters, and areas that were systematically chosen so that we had both. And then one step that's actually still in progress even after my thesis mission is looking into remote sensing of beaver signs, and that's in progress in collaboration with a few researchers and undergraduate in McGill and Nunavik Corporation. So it's not stopping there. We haven't answered all the questions yet. So on the next slide, there's just a map of some of the areas that we flew with the helicopter survey. And this is along the western side of Ungava coast in Nunavik, and there's a little map on the bottom left to see where it is in Quebec. And the white dotted lines are where we flew by helicopter, and the triangles are areas where previous to the helicopter survey, people had said they'd either seen beavers themselves or beaver signs like dams, lodges, and food caches. And so the blue circles are where we saw beaver signs during our helicopter survey. And you might notice that the triangles, that the observations from Inuit harvesters are much higher, much farther north than a lot of our observations during the helicopter survey. And that's just one of the benefits of including those observations from those local observations with those surveys, because while the survey is a snapshot in time that just captures at the moment where those beaver signs are, those Inuit observations and that Inuit knowledge that knows how the land was before and sees as they go on hunting, they see much more even transient events like beavers trying to colonize a new area, but potentially failing because of a lack of resources. And so some of these observations, we're seeing the beavers themselves coming into an area, and if we aren't seeing those signs appearing, they might have failed. And people even saw them coming along the coast, swimming along the coast as a shortcut to access new areas, although they're freshwater species that can access a quick way to enter new areas that are not necessarily accessible through the river systems that they have available. So those local observations add so much more to the story. And next slide, more than that, they're just the Inuit knowledge that knows the ecosystem in the past and where things have been in those ecological interactions. They tell so much more of the story. And so together that really paints a good picture of what's happening, of beavers increasing in Nunavik, of expanding northwards. We have a quote here from Willie King Jr. here in Tisuyak that says, "The elders say they didn't used to have beavers here a long time ago. I guess they're coming north from south. we're not used to beaver trapping. That's why they're starting to increase. And that brings us to the whole question of like the food preferences. With Cree, there's a lot more beavers hunted, trapped, but Inuit often don't have that experience and that traditional knowledge to trap beavers. And so asking community members what the first 3 words that they thought of when they thought of beavers, a lot of the words were about them blocking beaver dams and the beaver dams blocking Arctic char and concerns about that. But positive words in green included a lot of words related to Inuit clothing that they can use beaver fur for. And so some of the discussions happening with communities is about management possibilities and learning how to trap beavers and adjusting. But there's also just the question of preferences. The reality is that a lot of people prefer to eat what they know, is what one person had mentioned in interviews. And so there's a dynamic about those new species coming northwards and introducing new opportunities, but also really affecting local food that's preferred. And so going forward, next slide, this is not over because I finished my master's. This is still going on in collaboration with Nunavik Corporation, an undergraduate at McGill, and some other researchers. We've really started to expand into this more and look from satellite images, how to identify beaver dams. We're looking at new partnerships we've created with Ken Tape, who did the research in Alaska. We've created this Arctic Beaver Observation Network, which is just in its infancy, but looks at managers and researchers across the North who are dealing with the same questions and the same management dilemmas, and sharing ideas, sharing research approaches and lessons learned. And those collaborations are really going to take this project, continue to take this project forward and answer more of these questions, which we haven't been able to answer yet, about this new species and its impacts in Nunavik and across the Arctic. That's it for me.
Thanks very much, Mikhaela. And now Allie Ford.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm here to talk about my PhD work in progress, as well as my internship in Eeyou Istchee. So as Mikhaela mentioned, we take an internship approach. So before, I haven't actually done my fieldwork yet, since it was delayed by the pandemic. And also I spent considerable time developing this project proposal. So what I'm going to present first is based on some literature review. And then after that, I'm going to show some highlights from my internship in 2019. So my project is focused on biocultural keystone species, seasonal and phenological knowledges, and environmental change. Biocultural keystone species biocultural is a term that combines both the ecological and the cultural. So ecological keystone species is a term developed by Robert Payne that refers to species that are very fundamentally important for ecosystems. And cultural keystone species, a concept developed by Cristancho and Vining, as well as Garibaldi and Turner, refers to species that are very culturally important. So in this work, I'm using the term biocultural to combine those, and this term has been used by others as well. And the 3 species that I'm proposing to focus on in my work are blueberries, Labrador tea, and moose. So these species are important across the North, and they're very important in Eeyou Istchee as well. And blueberries and Labrador tea, as Murray mentioned, oftentimes research is often focused on animals in terms of food use, but plants are really important for Northern peoples. Ethnobotanists such as Alain Creillet and Nancy Turner have done wonderful work showing just how important plants are as both food and medicine to Northern peoples. And there's not always necessarily a distinction between food and medicine. And so for the Cree peoples, the concept of being alive well involves eating eating foods from the land, engaging with the landscape, developing relationship with the land. And so I'm really hoping that by focusing on these species, it's going to produce research that's relevant, as well as speak to community research needs. So next slide. Other concepts I'm dealing with in my research are phenological and seasonal knowledges. So phenology is just refers to life cycle stages. So for example, seasonal migrations, or when the leaves change color in fall, or when flowers have buds, those are phenological events. So traditional phenological knowledge was developed by Trevor Lance and Nancy Turner, and it just refers to traditional knowledges of these life cycle stages and processes and seasons. And as you can see in the figure here from Waswanipi with the 6 seasons, the harvest cycles are deeply embedded within seasonal cycles. And it really speaks to multiple aspects of this value chain, like basically the entire thing, because it's fundamentally important to how plants and animals live and experience the environment, like seasons and phenology are, but they're also important to how people experience the environment. And as was previously mentioned earlier, or alluded to, things can be used as seasonal cues. So for example, some Indigenous peoples in Western Canada, for example, will use the blooming of the wild rose as evidence that, as an indicator that something else is ready to harvest. So that's from Nancy Turner's work, but there's a wide variety of these indicators. So as was also pointed out, climate change is having many, many effects. There have been a lot of research showing that climate change is having a multitude of effects on the North. And it's also been shown to impact plant phenology. So I'm really interested in how seasonal and plant knowledges, including knowledge of phenology, is contributing to well-being and resilience through environmental change. Next slide. So that brings me to my internship. This was done with the Cree Board of Health and Social Services of James Bay. Myself and field assistant John Godfrey were supervised by nutritionist Chantal Lenouet. And I was based primarily in Mistissini, but I also traveled to Wamaqshtu, Shashasapi, Ojibwe, and Waswanipi. So we're there from June to October 2019. And I developed this booklet. It was primarily me with the supervision of Chantal and the Cree Health Board, developed this booklet and database to edible plants and mushrooms of Eeyou Istchee. So just both local plants and mushrooms, as well as introduced species that just have edible food uses. So you can go to the next slide. So all these pictures are pictures that I took. I took many, many pictures and identified, we held plant workshops at local multi-service day centers. And this booklet is to help ID edible plants and mushrooms. It has general food uses, instructions for harvest, preparations, recipes, precautions. A lot of the information came from field guides. And there were also Cree names that came from the Cree Dictionary Online, the Anti-Diabetic Plant Project, which is another project done by other researchers in the region, as well as talking to Cree elders. So these are all edible plants. Yeah, there we go. And so there are 57 so far in the current draft. There are 57 local edible plant and mushroom species. That's going to increase. There's also a lot more in the database. The draft is also currently over 135 pages, but that's also going to grow. And it's meant to be like an identification and nutrition tool for the community. So it's available through nutritionists, their offices in the Eeyou Istchee. And again, it speaks to multiple aspects of the value chain. So both how to find plants, where to find them, what habitats they grow in, when to harvest them, how to use them, if there are any precautions, if they're not, if there's certain ways they should be prepared, what kind of nutrition they have. And this is all information that we're hoping to expand on as this project continues, because again, my PhD work and this internship project is a work in progress. So yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ellie. And Alex.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Alex, and I'm a second-year master's student with Murray. And I'll share a bit about my work studying polar bears in the Eeyou marine region and one of the indirect impacts climate change is having on wild food systems on the coast. I can go to the next slide. So the Eeyou Marine Region, or EMR, is the coastal and offshore areas on the eastern side of James Bay, and it extends up into Hudson Bay. So my work focuses on the polar bears in the James Bay portion of the Eeyou Marine Region and the communities of Waskaganish, East Main, Bemidji, and Chesapeake. To build this project, Murray and I approached regional wildlife management organizations, the Cree Trappers Association and the Eeyou Marine Region Wildlife Board, to find out what their research priorities were and how we could use my master's thesis to address some of those priorities. Can go to the next slide. So in recent consultations by those wildlife organizations in 2018, community members identified the need for more polar bear studies. They highlighted that local polar bear populations were changing and that polar bears were coming in closer contact with humans in recent years than they had before. The Cree Trappers Association shared that the increasing polar bear activity was disrupting traditional spring goose hunting, and that families were not able to access coastal hunting areas in the same ways as they had in the past. Communities also noted that they prefer that researchers use non-invasive methods and do not capture animals along the coast due to concerns about animal health and safety. So following these discussions and reviewing this document, I spent the first several months of my master's developing a project proposal to investigate the ecology of polar bears in the EMR using methods that respected communities' ethical concerns. I then presented this proposal to the Eeyou Marine Region Wildlife Board, the Cree Trappers Association, and each of the coastal communities. We can go to the next slide. So polar bears. So top predators such as polar bears are important components of ecosystems that have large impacts on the population dynamics of other species. And global environmental changes are altering the way species interact with each other by shifting community composition, spatial temporal overlap, and behavior. So in the warming Arctic and subarctic, these global changes have reduced polar bear access to sea ice habitat, and in many places forcing polar bears to spend more and more time on the land and change their diet and foraging behavior to more terrestrial food sources. And this can have negative consequences for polar bear body condition and survival. But these changes in polar bear distribution across the landscape can also have direct impacts on human communities. So in the Eeyou Marine Region, increased polar bear presence has reduced community access to traditional spring goose hunting territories, which, as we saw earlier, goose is a really large component of the Cree wild food harvest. And this has also raised concerns from community members about spending time at their camps on the offshore islands. You can go to the next slide. So our objectives are to launch a field-based polar bear research program with community members in the Eeyou Marine Region, and with this, gather baseline information about polar bear genetics, diet, body condition, and habitat use in James Bay. We aim to, oh, sorry, you can go back. About the community-based polar bear monitoring led,
Sorry, Alex,
and also
okay?
given, oh yeah, that's good. So given that this population is at the southern edge of global polar bear range, it also provides an opportunity to study how polar bears react to warming conditions and understand possible future consequences for more northern populations. You can go next. Thanks. So to gather this information, we're using camera traps, hair snares, and Phenological interviews. So you can go next. So camera traps provide photos and detection data and are being used to evaluate polar bear body condition and habitat use. Next. Hair snares collect hair, which provide us with DNA and stable isotope signatures, which will inform us on polar bear genetics and diet. And Cree knowledge interviews provide Cree knowledge of polar bears in the region, which includes important information on current and historic trends in polar bear habitat use and behavior. We can go next. So the hair snares and camera traps combine to form this sampling station. And we can go to the next. So last summer, myself and 4 community field teams deployed 37 of these camera trap and hair snare sampling stations across over 400 kilometers of the Eeyou Marine Region. These stations collected 108 polar bear observations and 117 polar bear hair samples, as well as hundreds of other wildlife observations. Can we go next? So this is where we detected polar bears, and this video, you can click next, shows how the sampling station works. So the bear crosses the wire to investigate a scented bait in the center, and the hair gets caught in the wire as crosses, and then we come back later and collect that hair. And then obviously the camera takes pictures of this whole process. So we found that the polar bears were mostly on offshore islands in the Eeyou region, and that they were in mostly good, average or good body condition. So we're in the process now of using different island characteristics to try to understand patterns of polar bear detection on these islands. And this information will be used by the Cree Trappers Association and Eeyou Marine Region Wildlife Board to inform community members about which places are higher polar bear risk and monitor how this changes over time. And we go next. So the next step for this project is to complete the Cree knowledge interviews when this becomes possible given the pandemic. So this is a really exciting part of the project because it will allow us to more formally document the changes people have been seeing in polar bear populations and impacts that these changes are having on traditional hunting activities. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Alex. We're just running a little short on time, so I'm going to go through this next section really quickly and apologize for that. But one of the things that we've also done as a team is thought about how we can, rather than just focus on individual species and individual interactions like char and beaver, how can we look at a system-wide response, thinking through diversity, primary production, and secondary production. So this work takes advantage of continental gradients and species diversity and the general observation that diversity declines as you go from south to north and from warm to cold climates. And it takes a climate envelope-like approach to look at the current pattern of diversity across latitudinal gradients in Quebec and applying Orano's climate change projections on those patterns to think about predictions of likely changes in diversity if the current relationships between climate and diversity are maintained in the climate change future. And you see the magnitude of climate change being the largest at the coldest temperatures or the highest latitudes, and the magnitude of projected climate change slightly less in the south, but the predicted impacts on species diversity kind of being maximized at the far north, where there's relatively few species now, and more species would be projected based on this climate gradient-like diversity approach. Something similar with primary production, rather than using species diversity, looking at latitudinal gradients in primary production that would show a pattern like that, and a climate envelope prediction that looks something like that. And just going quickly, even more interesting is a secondary production approach, because although, as Ali points out, plants are really important, so are consumption of herbivores and higher trophic levels above herbivores in both terrestrial, aquatic, and marine systems. And so an opportunity to think about secondary production estimates. And I won't go into the details today, but we've tried to situate those secondary productions at a scale, 100 kilometers square of an average trap line in Eeyou Istchee, and in the units of the number, like the caloric requirements of people per day. So instead of talking about secondary production as kilojoules per meter squared, we're talking about secondary production as people fed through a local food system per 100 kilometers squared. And thinking about predicted changes in local food production as a function of climate change in reflecting this increase in productivity. So sorry to go through that so quickly, but of course these climate envelope approaches fall into the problem that correlation does not imply causation, that these aren't necessarily to hold in the future. But I think that approach does highlight that important general property that in a general sense, warmer is associated with higher diversity and more primary and secondary production. and such that as climate change warms in Northern Quebec, system responses to climate change are likely to involve increased rather than decreased diversity and increased rather than decreased ecological production. And that the impact on these northward spreading species on the existing species there is going to be one of the key outcomes. I'm going to end with just running through 9 adaptation strategies that we've identified for local food security. And I'm going to just read the heading, and there's lots of detail under each of those. But the first is to maintain the local food foundations. The second are possibilities around agricultural innovation that one of the students within Wheatcliffs has explored in more detail. The third is harvester support programs. And recently the Nutrition North program has announced a national harvester support program, which I think represents an important transition towards a focus on local food as solutions to food security challenges in the North. Redefining food sharing networks around the contemporary reality of Northern communities in Eeyou Istchee and Nunavik. Land, food, and culture-based learning related to some of the priorities around food literacy and youth engagement and youth knowledge that is going to be so critical. Just to point out, by the time Orano's 2040 to 71 time horizon has commenced, today's youth will be the parents, the providers, and the teachers of the next generation. What will they know and what will they be able to provide? How will the local food system live on through them? Adapting harvest calendars and weather responses. The possibility of more harvest of smaller bodied species. Dealing with invasive species as they move farther north. And finally, just focus on wellness and wellness of people. And the famous quote, "If the land is not healthy, how can we be?" offered by Cree elder Joseph Maskey Sr. from Wapakstu. And perhaps the possibility of inverting that quote to also ask the question, if we are not healthy, how can the land be? So a focus on wellness and community for effective stewardship of lands. So I'm going to end on that point to leave a little bit of moment for a few questions. And just sorry that we ran a little short on time, and appreciate everybody's patience for a very long presentation. And I'm just going to end with the question period with a couple of quotes from Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, who shared the concept of two-eyed seeing with the academic world. And he reminds us, only remembrance of the science of humility will ensure we do not destroy creation with our human ingenuity. And only when we see with two eyes will Western science be something more than blind and Aboriginal thought something more than lost. So thank you for the time to present our work today.
Thank you, Murray, and thank you for the team. That was really rich. Thanks for the approach in presenting. I appreciate also having the team members come in and highlight the work that they've been doing and well summarized. So thanks for all the preparation behind this. There is at least one question coming in the chat, but just before I go to the question, I just wanted to make one comment. We're really happy with this project. We're really impressed by what you've managed to do. It's done in a really respectful way and with a lot of intention of trying to bridge that distance between more conventional ways of doing research up north and what you've managed to do. So I really appreciate this on a very personal note. And you've really shown the importance. We often talk about this, about the importance of the process of doing research beyond the results that we get. And I think you and the students and your team members have really demonstrated this. You've been really very concrete in showing this, and I think it's really important, and it shows in the results of the project. So it actually ends up giving a lot better research projects. And maybe just the last comment I wanted to give is I think the internship approach is one of the most relevant approaches I've seen in terms of really helping to make applied research very context relevant. And it's interesting to see that in terms of building adaptation capacity and what's put forward in terms of competencies required for adaptation to climate change is something that is put forward. So I find it really interesting that through the research and the way that you're helping to train, for lack of a better word, but to bring students as part of their training, that this is part of it. And I think it's a really relevant starting point for thinking up and coming up with research questions that are relevant for the community. So I just wanted to put that forward because I think it's really rich. It's more of a program that you've presented here than one project. So congratulations to you and the team for this incredible work. There are a couple of comments, just one very quickly. Somebody wanted you to show the first adaptation strategy again, to just maybe provide a couple of words on it. And then I'll go to maybe a couple of other questions. We have time for this.
Thanks very much. I'll just move right back to that first adaptation strategy. And yeah, I think just to highlight a little bit on that one as it comes up is just, as we say at the bottom, that it's just coming here, that stable things need good foundations, and in times of change, uncertainty, and extremes, the foundations are what need to be looked after the most. And so as much as people need to do innovative things to adapt to climate change, so too do they need to do the traditional things and practice the old ways. So looking after the land and wildlife and maintaining rights and opportunities and equipment and knowledge required to access lands and camps in the offshore, and keeping the land and the water and communities clean and well protected are really important. And so even if looking after the land maybe at first glance doesn't seem like a direct climate change adaptation, as maybe new initiatives or action plans, they form the foundation of strength and opportunity from which all those other opportunities and solutions arise. So just and kind of promotion of local food use is really important. But as we say, all that food has to come from somewhere and has to be harvested by someone, and those places and people need to be looked after and promoted too. So a focus on the foundations. I hope that helps clarify that element.
Thanks for the response. A lot of comments coming in are just congratulating you and the team on a really great presentation. Maybe just a couple more questions. The first one is, and this is actually interesting because I think it's been looked at in the beaver study, but given the changes in species and their distribution over the territory and the migration up north, are there exchanges between communities to transfer knowledge about all of these aspects? And I think between the Cree and the Inuit, this is something, I don't want to answer the question, but I believe that there has been some of this in the project. Yeah, and I'll have one more question for you after.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Mikhaela if she's available to speak to that. She's got direct experience on that.
Yeah, actually specifically about beavers, there's been a lot of discussions, about planning workshops to have Cree come and teach trapping techniques and food preparation. We had the funding and all the plans in place to do that, but then COVID hit, and since then we haven't been able to do the travel between Nunavik and Eeyou Istchee for that. So we're discussing different possibilities to be able to do that. But even with the Hunting, Fishing, Trapping Association, we've been discussing different workshop possibilities for knowledge exchange, and a lot of the hunters are really supportive of that. And in our research, we also are supportive of that. And unfortunately, COVID's just delayed some of those activities a bit.
Really interesting because it's an adaptation strategy in and of itself. Maybe just one last question and we can conclude on this, but coming from Anlolu at Uranus, in your opinion, what lessons can be learned from the research program that you've developed that could be useful for analyzing climate change and non-traditional food systems in northern regions, but also elsewhere in Quebec or in other regions? What lessons would seem to you the most important ones, I guess beyond the process, the importance of the process, but beyond that?
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question. And I'll just highlight an element that I didn't have the opportunity to spend much time on. And that's just when you think of the value chain network or any other conception of the food system, how the vulnerabilities and the adaptation of that system are driven both by individual nodes and exposures and adaptive capacity, but also kind of system-wide properties about the ability of that system to reorganize itself, or its redundancies, or its bottleneck kind of choke points. We talk about use as being this critical choke point between all the other foundations of that system. And so just an example, you know, ecological production increases diversity and production, brings new species in. But as Mikhaela's work shows, if the people don't have the knowledge or the tradition or the identity to consume those species, then a component of the system around people and institutions changes very much the response of the system to a driver of an increased ecological production. So it's just a systems-wide approach, and thinking about how different components of the system connect with each other and either amplify or compensate for one another.
Well, thanks very much for that response. And I think your project has, I mean, the multiple projects within this program have definitely demonstrated that and the value of that. So thank you very much again for an excellent presentation and excellent work. Il me reste plus qu'à remercier tous les participants. Encore une fois, ça a été un bon succès avec vraiment plusieurs participants. Merci pour votre présence. L'enregistrement sera disponible via notre site Internet et puis on se donne rendez-vous pour un prochain séminaire, prochain webinaire bientôt. Thank you again, Marie. Thank you to all of the team members.
Thank you to Oranos for the support and the opportunity very much. Thank you.